record this session. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to How to Get Hired as a top tier bubble dev. We are here with the lovely Mike and the lovely Youssef from good old Minimum Studios, who everyone knows and loves. And I asked you guys to do this session because, one, I just want to know how to get hired as a top tier bubble dev. This is an excuse to force you to tell me how. But also because you guys have hired like a ton of devs in your time, and you are devs, and so you know what that process looks like, and you know how it works, and I'm assuming you probably also know how it doesn't work. So thanks for doing this, both of you, and thanks to everybody who's here watching. So first thing I wanted to do is just get like a rundown of your process. So if you don't know Minimum, you are a bubble agency. You work with lots of clients. You have been around for what, like 4 or 5 years or something crazy like that now, right?
Yeah.
2019 is when we started. Yeah.
Cool. And based out of the Netherlands. I got that right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Europe. Everyone's somewhere else, but all of us are pretty much in Europe. Yeah.
Cool. And I'm curious about how many hires you think you may have hired. How many devs you may have hired total in your life?
It's probably more than 15, less than 30, I think, between that. If it's just devs.
Yeah.
I don't know. So probably like 20 people, 20, 25 people, probably.
Okay.
We consider like, depends also what you consider a hire, right? We've worked with freelancers a ton.
Yeah, I would say, freelancers counts. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in total, so 20 to 30-ish in terms of people that we work with actively on the project would be fair. I think a lot more like portfolios that we looked at and people we spoke to in the early stages, but people that we ended up working with is around that number, I think. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So can you talk through your general process of like how from sort of from the job description to then like how you're looking at portfolios or emails or whatever comes through, what you require, and then just kind of what the process is, and then we'll dig into like different steps of the process.
Yeah, of course. High level, I think something that is a bit different. We usually start with a Loom, and this is something that we kind of found over the years instead of starting with the work, and it's mostly because we're an agency and we're remote. So we start with someone doing just a short Loom. It doesn't have to be anything crazy or new, but just for us to get a sense of who this person is and how they present. That's sort of our first thing to look at, a thing to filter, because that's what clients will see. And then from the Loom, we basically ask people to walk through something they already did. So it's nothing new, nothing additional. The second step there is that we reach out and we do an assessment, or at least we either ask for more details, or we start doing an assessment, or we have a call dependent on how the Loom was and whether we are interested in hearing more. If we get a good sense of what someone's good at already, we might go straight to the assessment and kind of do that async. And that is, we used to do something that was sort of a test project, so it was something new, but we've actually switched it now to just walk through an existing app that someone has done. So they have a few pointed questions on different categories. They do an assessment based on what they've already done, and they kind of show us their approach, so how they think about different parts of building. If that is good enough, or if we're interested in that, then we actually start to have a meeting with them pretty much all of the time. And Paolo on our team is heading the process, might actually, ask a little bit more or have a few more questions. And then we try to do one like trial project for a client, or to do one thing as a freelancer. And from there, we often do full-time hires from that pool because it's often people that we've already worked with on projects. So high level, those are kind of the steps.
You miss anything, Youssef? You got it all?
I will say it has changed a lot over the years. I think the Loom one, or like the inside of using a Loom, has been something we've been doing for a while. Now I think we realize that there's quite of an big abundance of people that have the skills, I think, to build things. But that isn't usually enough. It's something that we kind of like had to learn the hard way if you're doing agency work, because it's just client work in the end, right? If you're building your own app, you have the skills to build it. That's usually enough. But if you're working with clients, there's a part of it that's just service. So you will have to be, good at presenting your work and being able to communicate things, which has, I think, always made it a little bit difficult to hire certain people who had really good skills but are just like pretty lacking or poor in those areas, where they're just not very interested in getting good at those things. I think generally we're pretty willing to give people lots of chances and room to learn those things on the job, obviously, if we see, but there is like a level of, I think, we say like baseline charisma, whatever, that you kind of like need, I think, to do this correctly, which is more often than not like a reason to not work with someone, which is unfortunate, but it is kind of like we had to learn the hard way that was how it is, right?
So your devs are interfacing directly with clients?
Yeah, so I think everything's built upon that, and we're like investing more and more into infrastructure that supports that, where we're kind of like not having managers and people doing this kind of like middle management work where they're kind of like translating requirements or whatever. So we would prefer everyone to be able to just talk with anyone. So to do that, you do need like a really high level, you need people who are able to work autonomously, which is, I think, the standard in general these days for anyone that doing any kind of open or remote work. But yeah, you definitely also need to be able to carry yourself and know how to ask questions and, not be afraid and not be shy. So those things are very important. I think they're becoming more and more important. Yeah.
Yeah, got you. So in the Loom, what are they doing? I think I missed this part. What are they actually putting in the Loom?
Yeah, that's kind of open. So it's we kind of leave it up to the person, because it also says a lot about what someone is focusing on. So that some people actually present their life in a way, or present who they are in an interesting way. Other people really come with, okay, this is the stuff that I've built. That doesn't really matter to us, because it just says a lot about the person. We do, of course, provide a little bit of instruction, but it's more about, okay, what how did you get into Bubble, and who are you, and what have you been building? Some people take 30 minutes and show you all the cool projects they've done. Some people take 2 minutes. Both are fine, as long as there's something that gives us the idea that a client will also enjoy this interaction, or would be excited to get a message from this person. But I think that's very specific to us. Like Youssef said, like we're very focused on removing this management layer. I don't think that's a common thing in the industry necessarily. So yeah, sometimes we do put more emphasis on that, even though someone's skills are amazing. So it's not, I don't think that's the general rule for many of the other agencies. Yeah,
interesting. So do you find that most of the devs come and present an actual portfolio? Is that a thing that's common?
And not so much, I think. Youssef, what do you think?
Well, I think Pablo has seen most of them, so he'll know. But I feel like it's getting, right? Like, I don't think I remember seeing one like a traditional portfolio, right, where you would like have these are the things I worked on. I think mostly people just have experience and they just show what they've worked on. Lots of times it's hard to put people in portfolios because they work on stuff that they're not allowed to show. I think that's like a common thing that is like always the case, almost always the case. Yeah. Also, I think we're also not really looking for it, because we're also not interested in that. Like, I don't think we're like care about if you have like a portfolio that looks really good or anything. We're really more interested in, I think, how you are as a person, especially in that first stage when we're still like learning about you. And I also think for that, Loom is very useful because it gives you a lot of extra information that you don't really have if you just do stuff over email. Because I think we started at some point. I think we've had a version of this process where we had the Loom later, right, where we would have like a bunch of email communication and we would verify someone's skills. And then during the call, we would find out like, okay, this person is obviously really smart and capable, but like they don't have this like vibe of being a kind person that we want to work with. Right? Kind of like so also for like to save everyone time, also like we're like, hey, if we value that so much, let's pull that to the front of the process and kind of like just be upfront with it. If we feel like, hey, this is like just a mismatch on feel basis already, or like how you carry yourself, or we think it's going to be hard, or think it's not going to work, might as well start with that.
Do you give that feedback Any feedback around like their Loom?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah,
So go ahead, Mike.
yeah, we do more than we used to. But we basically have it always falls into one of the few categories, especially if you take it a little bit more broadly and also go for design and front end. So we always provide at least a pointer of, this is the reason why. It can be general, of course, because sometimes, you have so many applications, you can't like do a detailed piece of feedback for everyone. So that's also why we think like if the first Loom is a minute or two, it's fine, because you don't want to, it's really about saving everyone time. And if it's presentation skills, we'll just, tell someone, because then at least they understand, okay, there's something I can improve, but it's not the other part. But sometimes it's also location, for example. So we hire specifically in Europe and Africa. So it's better to tell people that that's the reason, because then at least it's not, you don't draw the wrong conclusion. Yeah.
So I'm curious about that with time zones. I'm guessing that's a time zone issue?
No,
No.
it's well, you've been to one of the retreats that we do with the team. We are fully remote, but we meet up a few times a year, and that's the biggest reason we want to be relatively close. Because if we have a really good connection with someone and they join the team full time, we want to be able to meet up a few times a year. And then suddenly, if you open up to Asia and in the US, in our case, it becomes a very tough thing to do. And then you get these separate people from the rest of the team. You don't want anyone to feel disconnected. So long term, it's really nice if we felt like there was a broad enough range, 2 continents. But still, of course, you run into many people that are great, and then they're in the US or in Asia. So that kind of sucks. But yeah, it does help. The face-to-face meetings really help.
Yeah, you do that. You said 3 times a year. Is that right?
Yeah, we try to. Yeah. At least
Yeah.
2.
Sorry, you.
Always happen at least twice. We always aim for 3. So, yeah.
Got it. Yeah, cool. So I am curious about the sort of, I know Pablo is on your team, and Pablo is Pablo in a position of sort of oversight? Is that my understanding is right? To some degree?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about how you handle people learning on, I guess there's a preliminary question here. The question is like, what is it that you want people to definitely come in with? And what are the things that like they could learn and you are comfortable with them learning on the job? And I guess I mean like hard skills, like bubble skills, but also, soft skills.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think you automatically go to soft skills as sort of the baseline. Maybe not skills you've already acquired, but at least the potential to have them. So we have quite a bit of sort of senior talent on the team, and for this reason, that we know that okay, that knowledge can be transferred while someone is working. We also work with a sort of a coach system. So once someone is working on the project, there's always a senior person with time to help them out. So we know the bubble side of things, and you know how it is with bubble. People can learn really, really quickly. So we're never really too nitpicky about, oh, you don't use the right naming conventions, or your database design needs a bit of work. Like that's not the part. If everything else is fine, we don't really care about that, I guess. The soft skills, I think what we look for most of the time is sort of an attitude that is very proactive and independent, and that's sometimes you can see it already in the way people approach us, or the way people actually send that first Loom and email. I often find some people actually send a message with, I really want to learn a lot from you guys. So they basically say, okay, I have checked out Bubble. I really want to learn. Can I do an internship, or can I work with you guys? But then other people actually send an email and say, okay, I've actually went down this rabbit hole. I've done this course, I've done that, and now I'm kind of getting to a plateau. I want to work with you guys to get better. And I think the second one is a lot more exciting for us, because it shows that someone is doing things and doesn't basically wait for permission. I think in essence that's the one thing that we're most excited about, is someone who just seems like if you leave them alone for 2 weeks, they will come back and they will have done a bunch of stuff by themselves and explored. That's a great energy to have.
Right. I would like to hear about the actual like hard skills, right? Like especially things like I work in a lot of apps that already exist and sort of clean them up. And I find that like data structure is just like a thing people do not know how to do. They just don't know how to do it. But like it's not easy to learn. Like there's not that many resources for bubblers, right? So I wonder how you think about like the hard skills that you just really like. Maybe I find that some people have a hard time with data structure, like just imagining that kind of thing. So like, yes, you can teach it, but it might take them 2 years to actually get it, right? So I wonder if you can talk about that, just hard skills.
Yeah, I think generally we do, I think, value soft skills a little bit more. If I just look back, and I don't think this is like a conscious decision, it's just like how we do things. I think the way we do hard skills, we just rely on, I think, the process. So we make sure that, when we ask people for things, we ask them to walk through their apps. We kind of like try to judge where their skill level's at. And from there, we kind of like try to take a little gamble or a little leap, right? Because we usually don't hire people immediately full time. There's always like a chance to work with them on something lower risk, right? So like a freelance project or something. And we know there's people on the team that can, if something goes wrong, they can support them, help them, even though if it means that the project then, is a bad project for us. It doesn't matter. It's worth it if it turns out to be a really good person to work with. So we just get, I think, enough information to be able to take the gamble and being like, okay, we feel like the person has the right attitude. So we're not worried about them, getting stuck, because they will at least know they'll ask the right questions and try to unstuck themselves. And if they have the right attitude, I think they'll, with knowledge that we have on the team, probably be able to figure it out, right? So if after that it's still a problem, I think we have, at that point we have a lot more information, because if we work with someone on a real project and they've demonstrated their skills and we feel like it's lacking, or there's not like a good fit there, I think then we'll probably have a discussion or something. But usually that doesn't happen, because we've got pretty good at sniffing that out like early. And even if someone's like, their skills are a little bit subpar, if the attitude is good and stuff, we usually find a good way to get them up to speed, because we know there's there's lots of ways to fix that problem, like the hard skill problem, and there's lots of people on the team that would like to help as well. So that's kind of like
yeah. So I think interesting thing here is that it's also really nice if people are able to judge themselves fairly, which is something that we look at as well. Is if someone says I'm really, really good at this part of the thing that I'm doing, or at like workflow organization, or at any kind of subset of building your bubble app, or for example, database design, what people say, like if what they say lines up with the thing they're doing or the app that they're showing us, we get a good feeling regardless of whether they're beginner or senior. So if someone says, I really suck at front end, and then you see a bad front end, it's totally fine, because they are kind of aware of it. And if someone presents, they say like, we had this rating system at first in the form where someone would apply and then would rate themselves on these aspects. And some people would put like 5 stars on something, and then we would see the walkthrough, and we'd see that they are basically beginners at that subject. And that often feels like a red flag, or feels like evaluating yourself fairly, I think, is a really strong thing to be able to do. And knowing where you are in terms of skills, even if you have to find that out through other people, is a really positive and good thing to present to an agency, because then they can also help out. And for us, it makes it very easy to say, okay, then we're actually going to pair you with this person and make sure that you get better. But if someone feels like they're already there and they're very senior at something, and they end up not being that, that's always a bad experience. So that's a good thing to know about yourself, but also tough, I think.
I kind of want to dig into that a little bit, because I remember when I first started learning Bubble, and like within a few weeks, I was like, I'm a genius. I am so good at this. And then I started working with another developer, and I was like, oh, I don't know anything. I'm the worst bubbler ever. Like, your skill level is really hard to judge when you first start out, I think. So I wonder if you can speak to like how do you know? How can people know what their level is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like the more senior people are, the lower they probably judge themselves. Like the more you know, the less you think you do.
Yeah.
I do also think it's also like a attitude, just character thing, because I think in general, if you're willing to be more humble about it, I feel like that's usually like a good like a green flag, right? I feel like if someone's very confident about their skills, and they have like a ton of experience, I don't know. I guess it just comes down to like a feeling thing most of the time for us. It's really hard to assess that because I guess unless you've worked with other people, like if you have experience working with other people and other teams, then I think you can really do a pretty good job at assessing yourself. So I think it's more about like where do people think they are, right? Not like what is exactly true. That makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. And being able to articulate it, I think some people would say, I'm just good at everything. We're good at all the aspects of it, or very good or decent at all the aspects of it. And it's a lot nicer if someone says, okay, I gravitate towards this part of building. I really enjoy front end, or I really enjoy APIs. That's already a much better answer. And it's true, you probably only figure it out by working with other people. So not everyone will know. But then as a beginner, then the most safe answer would be, I probably suck at all of these. And I just want to learn. Right? That's always safe. But finding out, it would be interesting. I'm not sure how, maybe by working with others or collabing with friends.
Yeah, I feel like that's particularly difficult in this world because number one, it's not that easy to collaborate on Bubble. Like you have to have like a certain level of account even just to, and two, like there's not an easy way to share work, to show your work. Three, if you're building for a client, probably there's some like privacy stuff there. I mean, there's just so many barriers in the way for learning. And when a course is async, right? I mean, it's a pre-recorded course and you can't ask questions. They can't show you their editor, a real editor, not just one made for a course. It's just a million barriers,
Yeah, I think that's the cutoff point we find often is if you see the difference in seniority immediately if someone has worked on an app that's used by a number of years. Like that makes it as well. It makes such a huge difference because I think you have that free and awesome feeling at first when you're building the course demos and your own apps. You're like, oh, it works. I'm so happy that it works. And then you start building for clients with users, and then you kind of your gray hairs just start piling up, and you learn so much. Yeah, same. You learn so much just doing that for 6 months or so. So that's something, if we want to assess someone, if we know they've worked on something that's live and used, we know there's already going to be a lot of learnings they had there, regardless of the app.
How do you think someone can get experience working on an app that's being used? I mean, that's the age-old question for any kind of career, right? How do you get experience if you have no experience? But any thoughts on that?
I mean, the obvious thing is just build your own things and try to launch them, right? You look at someone like Timo, for example. I think he's always been doing that from the start. He's gotten super good at Bubble. And I think before we worked with him, he never worked with anyone else, I think, in this kind of setting, right, Mike? This agency kind of like work. And we found him like he's just like sharing things he's working on and so on. So I feel like if you're, enthusiastic enough or you have like you're motivated enough by building your own things, you'll naturally just get those skills. I think your priorities are also in a better order that way. If you're just like more interested in like building something you really want to exist, then I think you'll figure out a way to get the skills, right, to do that. So that's usually a good way to do
and
that.
also really aligns with choosing Bubble as a tool. So if you're like most people would start with Bubble because they're excited about doing something all by themselves with no big team or no funding or none of that bullshit, basically. So if you're like everyone in this community and scene values pragmatism and values just getting stuff out there and building something tangible. So the more you can do that, like there's really no barrier. You know how it is. You can spend evenings and the weekends for a week or two and you have something functional. So if you can do that, you should probably do it and learn about actually shipping things and breaking things and failing. And all of those things are helpful when you work with clients that run a startup because they are doing the same thing. So it also builds like the shipping muscle, or it builds like the knowledge about how that whole process works. And I think if you really want to focus on one craft and just do that, then there's always traditional code where you can actually do that and work in a team of 16 people and do JavaScript. But I think if you do Bubble, it's really good to be entrepreneurial as well, because you basically have all the tools.
Right. I want to talk about, earlier you were talking about kind of, I'm really good at front end, or I'm really good at APIs, that sort of thing. And there's not a ton of conversation in Bubble at this point about sort of like specializations, right? And I hope we kind of go that way, but right now it feels like bubblers are just expected to know everything, right? You're just
Yeah.
expected to be able to build any aspect of any app. So I wonder how important you think it is to sort of niche in that way. Is that an important thing, or is it more important to have like just a very broad, just learn everything?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on what kind of things you're trying to build, right? I do think Bubble is more suited for someone that has a broad range of skills because it allows you to do everything. So I think it's also the reason why there's so many people, I think, in the community who are people that worked with developers in the past, were burned by that, decided to pick up Bubble themselves, and now are able to, run an entire company because their interest is more in having a business that is powered by software than just getting better at building stuff because they think it's fun. So I do think like just like the fit is better for that kind of thing, but obviously you can more and more. There's examples of you can push Bubble to go super far, and at some point, then it does make sense, I think, to you'd be like, hey, maybe I'm not very interested in seeing this through from a purely business perspective. I would much rather be keep on learning and figure out how I can go from this to something that a ton of people can use, or something that uses some external services, maybe some AWS stuff. Like there's lots of things you can branch out from, I think. But I do think as a baseline, it's probably a really good skill set to assume that you should learn pretty much just be able to build any kind of app until you feel limited. Because I also feel like there's a pretty natural ceiling with a tool like Bubble. It's not like with code where you will that answer doesn't exist, because you can literally build a thing and there's an infinite amount of things you can improve at. I think with Bubble, there's just like, there are things that just don't make sense to build, I think, at some point, or don't make sense to pursue. So within that, you can leverage your skills a lot, I think.
Yeah, design plays into this a lot, of course. Like you immediately gravitate towards, okay, what about how it looks, and what about how it's on the front end? And I think there is a split that we have in the teams. I think I agree with Youssef on the basis. So everyone should be capable of doing something from scratch and not dependent on anyone else with Bubble. And I think especially if you, for example, leverage these UI kits that are out there, these pre-built components, then you can at least be a full stack. Like, don't let anyone limit you. But then if you're then asking like, what do I enjoy doing? We basically have this 2-person split in a team, and it's less about skills because those are kind of transferable, but it's more about mindset and what someone enjoys doing. And we basically split up the process of building a feature in 2 parts. So we have the ugly functional version that we do first. So one person does that, which is the database design, the integrations, basically the backend developer, but they also they basically create a very ugly front end. And they also create like the navigation and the structure for the pages and the loaders and all those things. And then there's the designer and front end dev. So that's someone who's in Figma and in Bubble. And that person also has Bubble skills, but they wouldn't go and play with the API connector for a day or 2 to get something done. So there is sort of a natural split. First person basically makes sure that the feature is functional, and then the designer comes in, and we find that to be amazing because they're still working in the same app. So there's less translation issues with like, oh, the developer didn't actually build my Figma the way I wanted it to. The designer is in the app, so that they don't have that friction. Everyone understands the data, so there's a lot less communication there. And we do find that people generally fall into one of these 2 categories, regardless of their skills overlapping a little bit. So Youssef and I are a perfect example. We can both build, but Youssef is more of a backend guy and I'm more of a design and front end guy. And us working together is great because we both enjoy it a lot more than having to be full stack if we were alone.
Yeah.
So I think looking for a combination like that is really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I will say, I think that becomes relevant if you're working in a team. So I think if we're looking at this perspective, if you're like on your own type thing, I think it makes sense to dabble in all the things and be pretty decent at the front end side of things. But I do think like in a setup where you're working with multiple people and the apps are bigger, or the businesses that are using the software they require like a high level of, let's say, UX than someone that can, do everything on their own. I think then this concept makes a lot of sense. So for us with our team, it makes a ton of sense. We're actually really big fan of kind of like skipping working on the abstract thing and working on the real thing. Is like kind of like, we're always looking for a way to do that. And I think this thing of having Figma and bubble skills as a designer is something we're like investing more in, believing more in. So I think in the end, it's cool if everyone on the team has some bubble skills, because I think everything just becomes easier if you can all look at the real thing and just make decisions based on the real thing and not like make a picture of the real thing and then try to rebuild it again. So I think that in a team setting, this becomes very, very relevant. I think this idea of who's responsible for what part of the app.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when we were in Valencia and met up, we were talking about how like I do things the opposite way. I design first.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. I'm a designer, right? Like, of course, I'm going to gravitate to doing that first. But for me, we can hash out like what should happen before we actually start building anything. And so I can imagine like, I've always wondered about agencies in this way is like, you guys have your way of doing things, right? And if I were to come into your team and I'd be like, but this is my way of doing, like, how do you negotiate that when someone comes in and they're opinionated in the process?
Good question. I think overall pretty stubborn. So I think probably my initial reaction would be like, okay, let's not like immediately do that. But we're probably open-minded enough to learn a lot from like if someone's like if we feel really good about the person and we hired them and they have ideas that clash with ours, obviously we probably trust them enough to take them serious and be like, okay, what is there about this that we think is missing? But we will challenge it, I think, because I do think this is something that we've been doing it for a while and kind of like learned that this is the way that works, right? We've kind of like tried other things. We've literally done that as well for a long time, just designing everything up front, getting a sign off, doing it. And we've had so many problems and trouble with that, this was kind of like the first thing that really fixed it. So I think it will be hard to convince us, because I also just feel like, is there really a better way? I don't know. I haven't seen it. But yeah,
I think we changed the process a lot because of this, right? So someone would be like, oh, this is not working, or we would have a problem. So there's a feedback loop going on, but the new approach would be discussed with everyone else, and we would actually decide on it for everyone. So we don't let everyone just do whatever. So I think if someone has a great idea, I think this idea also originated, this like reversing the process at some point originated spontaneously because someone did it on a project. Then we just all looked at it and we felt like, oh, this is actually helpful. So everyone's open to bringing new ideas, but that's the thing with an agency, though. I do think you have to adapt to a process. Pretty much always. Yeah.
Whenever sort of newer devs come my way and we're talking about, like getting started and how to get your first client kind of thing, I always sort of, and I would love to hear your perspective on this. I always say, hey, go apply for an agency. You're going to be around, you're going to be working with other devs, you're going to learn processes, you're going to be working on a lot more projects than if you were freelancing. It's a little bit like less frequent, I guess. And you don't have to market yourself necessarily in the way that like a freelancer does. But at the same time, like I feel a little weird saying like, hey, go cut your teeth. These are still clients, right? They're still paying for a professional to build their thing. And if they're not quite at a professional level, that's not fair to the client, right? Do you think that an agency is a good place to, maybe not your agency, I don't know, but like a good place to kind of get started? Or would you recommend like, hey, do a bunch of projects on your own, even if they're your own, right?
Sí.
Is it, do you mean starting an agency or joining an agency?
Joining as a dev.
Yeah.
Like, if you were a new dev, brand new, like you started maybe 2 months ago, right? And you feel pretty confident, but you're not quite sure, right? Would you go and try to freelance, like get on whatever, Upwork or, just like talk about yourself on Twitter or whatever? Or would you advise like getting on at an agency and getting some like experience under your belt in that way?
Yeah. I think the second one, So we're kind of biased, of course, but I think dependent on the agency, because there's also agencies that are a lot more like networks or like platforms. So if it's a small agency that lets you work directly with other people and you know there's actually senior talent there that you look up to, if you know there's time for you to really be like a sponge and to soak up some knowledge, that's good. But I think there's also agencies that you basically join a Slack group and you're part of this huge workforce and you're still kind of on your own, and you just get paid less because you're junior. I would avoid that because then you might as well be freelancing for maybe twice the rate, and you would have a similar experience, just apart from sales and marketing. So if you know you're going to be really coached somewhere, which there's enough agencies out there that will do that, I think that's a great choice because learning Bubble and maybe some front end and dealing with clients and marketing and sales and bookkeeping, all of those things in a few months is probably just, yeah, it's really stressful. And you can always do that afterwards. Like it's a great way to make a name for yourself.
Yeah.
I will say that I think freelancing is probably the fastest way to learn just a wide range of things. Not just because I think if you would join, it sort of depends on what you want to learn, I think, right? So if you just want to get better at Bubble and the skills, obviously if you can find a place where you can focus on that, and you'll be taken care of, right? Like, hey, here's a project. Don't worry, like we'll make sure that whoever's paying for this is going to get good software. So if your goal is purely that and you have that opportunity, you should definitely do that, right? But if your goal is more like, hey, I want to be able to build my own things and be able to launch them, I think maybe going for the freelance route is actually, not a bad idea. You're going to learn so much more about entrepreneurship and how to, you're going to need to send your invoices. You're going to need to do bookkeeping. You're going to need to do all the things that any entrepreneur does. So I think that those skills are part of your goals, it might make more sense for you to do that.
Yeah, I wonder also if there's some personality stuff there too. Like, I don't necessarily want to work on a team, so freelancing works really well for me, but some people, want that camaraderie, right?
That's a big reason for a lot of people as well. Yeah, they're kind of done with freelancing at some point, want to join a team and have more of a group feeling. But
yeah. I think also one thing I've learned over the past year, since sort of like things started opening up after COVID and all of a sudden there's conferences and stuff like that, is, I've met all these people in person and everything was online, obviously, before. And so I had like Bubble friends, but meeting people in person, just there's something about it, right? That like, you just feel more comfortable asking for help if you need help, or yeah. And I wonder if like your in-person meetings, I mean, I think like you can navigate that yourself, right? You can create in-person stuff wherever I've met bubblers all over the world, they're just everywhere, right? It's just, you have to find them and meet them, and then you help each other, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say, I think it is interesting because that's something we're trying to figure out. Like, what's the balance, right, between meeting each other and getting kind of like the upside of seeing people in real life? Because every time we do it, I think we get this like huge amount of new energy, right? That kind of like puts everything into perspective. It's just a lot easier to realize why you're doing things or why things are set up this way if you can see each other in real life. And that is something, I guess, with this kind of like the Bubble community is kind of like primarily an online thing that people are working with. So it's strange. I think, for example, with Pablo, we've been working with him for like almost a year, but we've been interacting with him for like, I don't know, 4 years or something on Twitter. And it's really strange if you think about like how it felt before, we actually met him and decided to work with him and met up with him in real life versus the kind of like 3 years before that, where we were, talking to each other and exchanging ideas. There's a lot of, I think, stuff that's kind of like you can unlock by physically meeting people and talking about them with this stuff. So I don't know, I will say it is worth going and meeting people. I think it will definitely teach you a lot more about like anything you would want to learn about, if it's even if it's like Bubble related or like entrepreneurship related. So I do think there's more there than we see on just being on Twitter. So yeah.
I had a question about, you talked about sort of location, right? For yourself, for
Yeah.
your agency, like why you hire in Europe and Africa. But I hear this question quite a bit from developers, you know, who are not in either North America or Europe, right? Who are like wanting to get hired by clients in North America or Europe. So I would love to hear any advice that you have, I guess, on that, if that's something that you can speak to. I get this question a lot.
Yeah, I think we can. Yeah, and because we see this saw this in applications a lot as well. Of course, like you see the division of where people are located, and I think the bubble community is pretty global in that sense that there's a it's no longer concentrated anywhere at this point. If I kind of reverse the question, think about the reason why we haven't worked with some people, for example, in Africa, where we do get a lot of applications. It can be communication skills. I think that's the sort of the and maybe not the skills, but more like English proficiency or presentation skills that can sometimes be lacking, even though the work is good or is okay. And that's a tough hurdle to pass. Basically, not necessarily for ourselves, but also for clients, right? So you want to make sure the communication with clients is super smooth. So if anything you can do to make sure that like English presentation skills and proficiency is really, really great, that's a really good investment. Same thing with like presenting yourselves online on a Loom or in a meeting. That's such a good investment because just being able to articulate your thoughts well and being able to communicate well is so important. So I think that's the biggest reason. If I do have to put it on region, that's the biggest reason that often people would not go through the hiring process. And it's just always a really good investment. Yeah.
What would you
I think
do?
it's, I will say like,
sorry, go ahead, Youssef.
I think it's also like, I think a lot of people, they put themselves in a category of like, I'm not good at this stuff, or I'm like, no, that's not my personality. And I do really feel it's a skill. Like, I think just if I just very simply look at people in our team, how much they've improved, like in the last, couple of years, or just ourselves, like it's going to be crazy if we go back and view like a Loom we presented 2 years ago to a client compared to now. Anyone on the team, it will be like a night and day difference. So I think it's important to kind of realize that it is something that you can learn and do by just practicing more, right? So I think often it's a bit tough because it sounds like a harsh thing to say to someone, because obviously, especially if we're like agree with that their skills are good, right? Because we're just trying to be honest there, or like transparent there, because often the skills are really good. It's just like not because, but it's also just like the dynamics of specifically our business, because we only work with US clients, right? So we kind of like have a ton of experience and know what will happen if we don't have like very smooth communication. Because even with us right now and everyone on the team doing a really good job, it still goes wrong quite often, because it's just really hard to have a remote team and have people do async stuff and everyone always have the right information and understand. So anything, so like for us, if there's lots of options, because there's tons of good people, we're automatically gonna have to gravitate to the ones where that problem is less, right, where we can solve that easier. So and I think it has also happened in the past where we've worked with people that have come back to us later with lot of big improvements in this kinds of things. So I think it's important for people to realize that you can improve that, and you should, because I think it's also like a timeless thing. Like even if in 2 years bubble isn't relevant anymore and we're all using something else, those skills will still be relevant, right? So it's important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think one thing that you get with freelancing is this sort of project management and project planning that I know a lot of agencies will have like a project manager, or like the leadership team will work with the client before they ever hand it off, right? And that's a skill. How do you even learn that? Like literally.
I think just by messing up like 5 or 6 times, big time, and then spending 3 times the amount of time that you thought you would be spending on an app. I think if you do that a few times, you automatically become very focused on project management. But I think I do think that's why I think agency is an interesting route to take at first, because you at least you can look at how other people are doing it, and you can kind of look at a scoping process. or just ask around, or like work for another freelancer, maybe like help someone else out, but at least look at how someone else is doing it, because we've been there as well. It's really tough to scope out projects and to talk about software with non-technical people and clients. It's such a difficult thing to do. So it's great to learn. It's really great to learn, but it's also a very hard problem to solve. So it's a lot easier, I think, to solve it if you have some references, and you have at least someone you can ask. And then, of course, you also have clients, so you can manage your project perfectly, but the clients can just be awful.
Right.
It happens. Yeah, it just happens to everyone. Like, we'll tell you when we have a fix for that.
Yeah, I was wondering, that might be an interesting angle on this, is like, how do you vet clients? Like, if you're a freelancer or, an agency, I imagine it's a similar thing, right? Like, what do you look for in red flags for clients or green flags?
I recently made a doc for this, actually. Yeah, let me just open it up, because I was so done with bad client relationships. I was like, I'm just gonna make like a green and red flag list to qualify people with.
Well, and if you guys don't share or follow Minimum on Twitter, you should, because they share a lot of their sort of like processes and stuff. So
yeah, I should throw this one up because the red flags are mostly important. Basically, if someone is a big company with a small budget, that's a red flag for me, because it means they can afford it, but they're kind of going to squeeze. But it's probably for freelance not so relevant. Anyone who says that it should be simple or easy. So you have, the type of clients that say in the first call with no experience, they say, this should be simple. I already have a spreadsheet. You just need to port it over. So anytime someone says the word just, I kind of like take a step back and I'm like, okay, that's going to bite us back later, which is also a green flag if it's the opposite way. So if someone's open and curious and asking you, hey, how much time and effort does it cost to do this? If they are interested but not making conclusions for you, that's a really good sign, because then they will also take you seriously when you tell them, like, this is actually quite difficult. Can we simplify this? So that's one thing. I think simplifying things is really big as well. There's a lot of clients out there that want everything and they're not open to cutting scope. So if they're just adding and they're not open to, if they don't get excited about you proposing like a simpler version or a smaller first version to start launching with, that's often a kind of a sign that they will keep doing that and they won't be helpful during the process. So if you propose something that's smaller and more simple and they are very excited about that, I think that's often a really good sign as well, because then you'll be able to ship real things. So there's
I think being able to see the value in that and not interpreting that as like I'm getting less now, right? And not seeing like the work you have to do to simplify it is very important, I think.
Yes, it's all about kind of valuing the scoping work. So if you do some things for them in the sales process and you ask them questions, if they value that, that's often a really good sign. If they kind of disregard it, feel free to kind of walk away a little bit from it.
It also mainly shows like how they think about you. Like I think if you're framed as someone you're working with, like a partner, then you're obviously it's also like a sign of respect, right? By not making assumptions or taking conclusions on your behalf. Otherwise, it's more of like you're just like the guy that takes care of this, or like the person that does this job. That's not the case with how software works, right? We all know, everyone who's built any software, anyone that has any experience working in any software project knows it's really complicated, right? And it's kind of like chaotic, and it never goes as well as you think it will. So I think kind of like ignoring that, that's a big red flag. If someone's just like skipping over those things and being like, I already figured it out, you just have to build it.
Yeah, I found that gentle pushback, not pushback is the wrong word, but just like asserting an opinion early in the process, even in just the first phone call, has been a really useful tool to see how they'll respond, but also to kind of establish like, I'm the expert in this, right? And
have you got a surprising reaction from that? Like, did that ever happen that you got into a bit of a conflict because of it?
No conflict. Not that I can think of, but
they're pushing hard enough.
Yeah, maybe I'm not mean enough. I should be a little meaner. Learn from you guys, I guess. No, I think people are generally like relieved that they're not going to have to carry the whole project themselves, that they have someone that like knows enough to be able to have an opinion, because I think that there are a lot of devs who will take the project and execute it to whatever degree, and then what the client wanted wasn't the right thing. What the way they approached it wasn't right. They don't build software, right? And so even if the dev delivers, it's not going to work the way that they like imagined it, because they couldn't articulate it or they didn't know it was involved, right? So yeah, I found it to be like, people are like, oh, thank God, someone who knows what they're doing,
That's also a huge one, by the way. If they clients are generally not able to articulate everything, of course, because they're not technical. That's fine. But some clients have some leads have a really big issue with actually getting anything on paper. So these people that you talk to, in every meeting that you talk to them, it feels like their plan has completely changed, and you don't really see a paper trail of that change. So some people come up and they have a brief, and the brief is not technical, but it's a good brief. Like they've clearly defined what they're trying to do, and they're just good at writing things down. And some people are good at inspiring you and talk a lot, but then every meeting you get different details that you didn't know before. So we also try to look for people who are really good at least writing things down in their own language, and creating some kind of coherent brief. That's also a really good predictor of how clear someone is going to be later on. Yeah.
To add on to that, I think a version of that, or like a way I see that, is when you work with people and you are actually asking them to do something like that is, let's say, part of the scoping process or part of this process. Like it just the way they execute that, I think, will also tell you a lot about how they think about like working with you and what kind of client they are. Because if the client is really like kind of like helpful, they're willing to do kind of like adapt to your process. That's like a really, really big thing. That's like a really green flag for us, because we know like, okay, this person is someone that if we come up with something that we feel strongly about, because we feel like has it worked before, or we suggest like a fix, if the client then reciprocates that by kind of like working with you in that new way, that's usually like a really good recipe for actually solving problems, besides just like them raising something and then you proposing something and then not really going anywhere or nothing really happening with it, because you often are there's like parts of it you are dependent. You can't like solve everything without like the client. So you'll need to partner up on a bunch of these things and work on things together. So they will need to get their hands dirty, and they will need to kind of like understand that that's part of building software if they want the right outcome, right? And it's not just like a matter of telling you what they want and basically telling you when it's wrong, because that's just gonna be very expensive, painful process of doing it over and over again. One is like unhappy, right? So it's isn't a great thing. So yeah, there will be parts where the client will have to get their hands dirty. I think the way they respond to that is a really good sign. I think you should watch out for.
Yeah. Okay, so I see we have 3 minutes left, and everyone who's come in a little bit later, really apologize that we haven't been taking any questions. We turned off the chat because people were hijacking the calls. So I'm sorry that I can't take your questions. So I'm trying to ask the questions I think you would ask. I am going to ask one about pricing. Now I know that you guys have what you pay people, right? Like you have that already settled. But I would love it if you could speak to how developers should think about how they price their services, what they should expect, what is the range for a Bubble developer these days?
Yeah, I really like how Alex thinks about it. Flywheel. I think he always says like, we build real software, so we should we build like real software engineers or software companies. I think that's a good way to think about it. I think you should just think about the value you're delivering, right? If and kind of like, I will say it is helpful to have some examples. So I would say, and it's easy to get it. I think you can just ask around. There's tons of people that will tell you like, hey, this is what I charge, this is what I charge. And you can also ask people what they paid for a certain project, whatever. So most people will be very charitable giving you that information. And based on that, you can do pretty good, I think, assessment of like, okay, this is what I can, comfortably promise with my skills to someone. So what format that is, if that's a fixed price or hourly thing, that obviously depends on the project, but you can get a pretty good estimate, I think, for what you should be charging based on that. Yeah.
Ask around.
Yeah, I do think in terms of the type of pricing, I would always start with hourly if you don't have a ton of experience, because you avoid the endless out of scope items for a fixed project that could happen. So I think just in terms of risk, if you're starting out and you're just kind of trying to test the waters, just do hourly, and because then you have some leverage on maybe raising your rate at some point. If you know exactly, if you've done quite a few builds for clients, and you kind of know how much time you're spending on each aspect of it, then I think it's more safe to go for something like a fixed price for a build. But it's really risky to do that out of the gate, because you're pretty much like, there's 90% chance you're wrong, and that's often not in your favor, especially if you have
You're
if you
always
have a
wrong.
reputation to build. Yeah, you're kind of like, you're never like wrong, and you're done like 5 weeks early, and you're like, oh, that's great, that goes straight into my pocket. That never happens. So yeah, watch out with fixed price until you've done a few similar projects and you really know. You can scope out it.
Yeah, the tricky thing is, even if you do hourly, they want to know how many hours. So like, you are giving, it's maybe not fixed, but like an estimate anyway. I always like 1.5
Yes.
it, my estimate. I would just say
That's
1.5.
that's good. Yeah, there's a lot of these tricks, and then you're still probably at 1,
Yeah.
right, in the end.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
always like at 1.25. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the shittiest discussion you have to do as a freelancer or agency building stuff, because it's the least fun part of everything, because you just want to do good work. But I do think at least providing an estimate is a lot safer, especially if you're a solo freelancer. I think it's very as an agency, I think if you give a price, you're very responsible to just deliver that for that price. As a solo freelancer, and especially if your rate is lower, so someone knows that you're not senior or you don't have a ton of experience, then I think it's fair to give an estimate. And it's also okay to be wrong on that estimate, especially if the client makes things more complicated than you thought.
Yeah.
But then at least you have some freedom over that, and things can change. And as a solo freelancer, it's a lot less hurtful than as an agency not coming up to your agreement, I think.
Yeah, and I think being able to have the confidence to say before you do the work, like, you're asking for something that we didn't talk about before. And so that is going to be longer. And I don't know how much longer. It's an unknown. Yeah. So like, if you're comfortable with the budget expanding in order for me to do that, then great, I'll go forward and do it. But also like, get that in writing in an email or something, Yeah. That's a whole other question about contracts and stuff, but
yeah. I think if you have any ongoing thing, it's really valuable. As in, I think that's how we started as well, with just the two of us, is we just had a monthly price that they could afford, and we just did a sort of few proof of concepts before going into that. And that helped us, because then they understood. We just focused on how much can we do in 2 or 3 days back then, because Bubble was so new. It was kind of like, oh, we can go so quickly. I think once you establish pace, and they understand, oh, about a week of you working equals roughly this output, or at least this is how fast you can go, then suddenly you have some trust. And I think from that trust, it's a lot easier to say, I'm working for you 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And then basically all of those discussions are out, and you don't have to discuss every feature. And the only thing you have to discuss is priorities. And of course, you have to maintain that trust by shipping things, but that's the fun part.
Right.
And it's your responsibility.
Yeah, the sooner you can get to something like that. Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah, cool.
Sorry, I think this is something we've been doing from the past, which I think has been helpful. Right now we call it discovery projects, right, Mike? But we've always had like a version where we did like some of the work for like a refundable lower fee than we would normally charge people, and we would tell them upfront, like, hey, this is a lower price, but this is kind of like a chance for you to get a taste of like how it is to work with us. And that's, I think, has always worked really well for us, because if you're confident in your skills and you can do a lot and you can impress, you can kind of like dictate how much you want to give, how much work you want to do for that, because you're often it's not going to be like the most lucrative thing, but the scope is going to be small, so you're not losing a ton either, right? So that could be, I'm going to spend a week scoping out this thing and building something, or like doing a prototype or something. I think just doing that, showing up with something that you built to someone that's paying you for that work, will give you a lot of trust. So after that, the negotiations will be a lot easier because they will know like, okay, you can do this in a week, and you've structured this in a way where I got a lot of value from this smaller thing. Then they'll be a lot more willing to actually work with you in a way that you want to work. Where it's like, hey, I want a monthly fee, or I want this fixed price thing, or I want this my hourly rate, because you just give them a lot more information. Because if you think about it from their perspective, they will often have a project, have a budget, just go shop around, right? And if most people are sending them Google Docs with like, hey, this is what I charge, this is the scope, and you send them something you built and works, it's a lot more interesting to go with that person to work, because you have more information, right? So yeah, that's a tip.
It's so interesting, the idea of I know that a lot of clients will be like, let's do a test project, or can you do like a free do a little mini project for free? And I've always just kind of bristled at that. Like, people should get paid for their work, right? But I've never thought about the developer putting that forward.
You get to
right.
terms. That way you get to decide how you want to do it, because if you think it's okay, promise that you're at least not like, they can decline still, but you're like, if you're okay with doing a week of work for a certain amount of money, that's still worth it to you, and you get the upside of landing the client, or the downside of kind of like firing them early. Yeah, that's good.
But there's one more thing. It's also a way to scope. So we always used it as one way to convince a client, of course, because we say it's refundable. And to be honest, like, I think 95% of them have converted. So like, it's almost always, once people are already there, it's fine. But it just makes it a lot more frictionless. But for us, it actually helps us scope out what we're actually going to do. So we get paid for the work if they go through the project. And we're going, like, we always do the hardest thing. So we always pick like the thing we're mostly worried about in that project. So then once we actually start the build, we've already figured out the hardest thing. So it helps us set price. So it's good for everyone at that point.
Yeah, I've heard of people charging for scoping, but that always felt like such a hard sell to me,
Yeah.
Same thing, just a different way of framing it.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting.
If you have a week of diving into a problem, you will know so much more than like any research you can do front in a scoping thing. Right. So if you try to build something for a week straight, you'll be so much closer to a scope that is accurate than just Googling and trying to keep it under an hour or two, because you don't want to spend too much time on something you're not getting paid for. Right. So it's just to align the incentives.
Yeah. Oh man, I wish we had another hour. You guys, thanks. And sorry, everyone, we're over by 6 minutes, but appreciate you hanging on. And thanks you guys for doing this.
Of course.
It was so fun.
Of course.
Cool. Well, if people have other questions, I know you didn't get to ask questions, but if you have questions, find me on Twitter and ask them. And I don't know, maybe we'll do another one of these at some point, and talk more about working and all the things involved in it. So for now, go to your other sessions. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us, Kelly. Appreciate it.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.